Before we dive into today's episode, I've got to tell you about my personal journey with Munn Avenue Press. As an author myself, I've experienced firsthand their magic in turning books into bestsellers. They empower aspiring authors, giving voices like mine the platform they deserve. If you've got a story to tell and a dream, Munn Avenue Press is the ally you need to publish and market your book. Visit them at munnavenuepress.com. That's MUNN press.com to start your publishing journey, just like I did. Welcome, Season Sixers. As always, thank you for being part of our Color Success podcast family. I'm your favorite host, Dr. Stephanie J. Wong. Keep your eyes peeled for my brand new book coming out. It's called Cancel the Filter, where I share my experiences in the realm of mental health, both professionally and personally. Subscribe to colorsuccesspodcast.com to be on our waiting list. Seats are limited and being filled as we speak. We're also streaming on all your favorite platforms and socials. Whether you're on the go or comfy on the couch, you can tune in at your own comfort. As you know, we love growing discussions with our guests from our AAPI and minority communities. With so many friends and experts from different aspects of life, we love learning their stories and understanding what their success means to them. Let's get into it. Satchel Stillwell is a licensed professional counselor and supervisor in Texas. He's been counseling individuals and families for the last 11 years. He specializes in treating substance use disorders. He also sees clients 13 and older with any other presenting issues that aren't related to SUDs. Well, today I welcome a special guest, Satchel Stillwell, and I am so excited to dive into this topic as a mom and a dad perspective, as well as both being clinicians, on how we value females and our girls to grow into adulthood. So, Satchel, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me. I am honored to be here. I love your podcast. I love your book. So it's a huge privilege and definitely an honor to be here to speak with you today.
Satchel's one of my heroes because he has 3 kids?
4 kids.
4 kids, even more so. But 4 kids is wow. So, and how many of those are daughters?
I only have 1 daughter. So our first children were twins, Landon and Lucy, and they both just turned 9. So I have 1 daughter and then I've got 3 boys. So Cash is my middle son. He's about to be 7. And then Canyon is our newest little addition. He's about a year and 6 months.
You're busy. You're really busy.
Lots of chasing going on.
So I'm sure you could have related to some of my stories for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. It's just real life. I like the vulnerability. I like the fact that I always like to read books from the perspective that's just real life, like a lot of my colleagues, we call it real talk, just like real talk, like I'm struggling right now, and so I love the vulnerability that's presented in that book. And especially with regard to the aspects of raising children and just those moments that are just funny, and it's okay for those moments to be funny and still fruitful and productive and take away like valuable lessons from them as well.
Absolutely. We learn from our kids too, right? And so it's this bi-directional relationship. And so I guess one way that I'd like to jump in is I'm going to start a little bit broader. At what age do you think girls are starting to become aware of if they're being valued or not in the household and society?
Yeah, so this is a question that is really interesting to me because I work with not only males, but I work with females and I work a lot with teenagers. And as you probably know as well as I do, any teenager is going through a bit of an identity crisis. There's this identity like formation. And I know for me, I had probably 3 completely different identities all the way from freshman to senior year in high school. And if you ever talk to Justin, he could attest to that as well, that I changed a lot during high school. And I think part of that growth is really, it's natural and it's really important because the adolescent they're in that stage of trying to figure out who they are. But one thing I find true and I won't say universally true, but I'll say a high percentage, I find this to be true, is that a lot of the female clients that I work with, if I ask them this question, I get varied responses. And typically the response to this question is an age that I think is way later than I would have thought. And that's
Hmm.
the thing that is shocking to me is that the women that I speak with, the teenage girls that I speak with, they report feeling valued at a much later age where I would think probably like 8 or 9, around my daughter's age. These females that I've spoken with probably don't feel valued till like 22, like into their early to mid 20s. And I found that to be very interesting. So that's kind of why I really wanted to discuss that with you and kind of see what are your experiences clinically working with that population.
Yeah, so I mostly work with adults. And so, I'm seeing in real time my daughter kind of going through some of these changes, especially because when we are seeing things on social media, which we'll get into, and the peer groups start to form cliques and people are starting to categorize who's cool or whatever, who's not, you couldn't pay me to go back. I mean, maybe there might be a sum of money there that I would go back, but
Would you go back knowing what you know now, though?
exactly, right? And so that's also a dependent variable that I would have to figure out. So, I think women, girls are sent messages every day, obviously, from our loved ones, media, society. And so I guess I wonder, how and when does it click that these are actual things that they're being fed? And maybe it is when they finally realize that, wow, I went through a whole bunch of stuff, a whole bunch of crap, and this is how I feel about myself right now.
Hmm. I think it really starts at this identity, purpose, and design. With that identity formation, what I find with adolescents, because and I always say I've got the advantage of working with the pre and the post, because when I worked in the inpatient side of things, I worked as a clinical director for 7 years, but simultaneously I was working with kids ages 4 and up. So pretty much age group 4 and up has been my experience. So I've dealt with, I guess my youngest client would be 4 and my oldest client would be about 78 years old. So getting to see this full spectrum of life, I think is really it's really interesting. And you mentioned the social media thing. I wonder too how often that plays into the messages that are received, because I noticed that there's a major social comparison going on. And it
Hmm.
seems like everybody's got their highlight reel on. So, and even me, I felt guilty. I was thinking about this the other day, and I thought to myself, what do I post? What am I posting on Instagram? And I thought, it's almost like an altar to me. It's like all of my best moments, all of my most fun times, all of my highlight reel. It's like this is like this. It's kind of narcissistic. It's kind of like a bit grandiose because it's like a celebration of all the coolest things that you do. And I wonder though, because we have the social comparison, we've got the Facebook depression disorder. So this comparison between basically this life that I'm envisioning for myself versus what my current reality is.
Yeah, and peers can be mean. There's cyberbullying, bullying, and all that. So, I mean, what is your perspective on why you think people answer that 22 they become aware? Because it surprised you. So, any hypotheses as to why that's the case?
I don't know if I have a hypothesis necessarily, but it made me very sad as a father to a daughter that's just turned 9. One of the things I've realized raising a daughter, and truth be told, when I was before I ever had kids, I wanted a daughter and a son, and I figured if I could have a daughter and a son, I'd be set. And I didn't know that God was going to give us twins, so we ended up with a daughter and a son at the same time. But I did pray for that, and I asked God for a daughter and a son, but He had a sense of humor and gave me two at once. But um, I I find it sad that it would take that long for somebody to feel valued by society. But I think when, truth be told, I think that the problem starts with the male. And I'm going to kind of explain and dive into that a little bit, because I think as I've been sort of wrapping my brain around this topic, I was thinking about the way that we speak into the young female, the way that men, especially as fathers, but even beyond that, I think just as as adult men, as we speak into young females, what are the messages that we're carrying to them, and how are those impacting their development and their realization of self? Because that self-worth is the thing that I see that is so shockingly low with the majority of the female population that I work with. And I'd say that's probably, adult on up, 18, but below 18 as well. But again, still the identity formation. But if we're just talking clearly about adults, I see a very consistent theme of low self-worth.
So, what do you think are the messages from a male father perspective that many of these young girls are getting?
I don't know. I'm not in those homes and I don't get to hear those conversations. I don't know that it's so much about the messages that they're getting. I think it's about the messages that they're not receiving. I think it's about the things that
Hmm.
they're not being told. I don't think that they're being told that they're loved. I don't think that they're being told that they're good enough, that they're pretty enough, that they're smart enough, that they're strong enough. I don't think that we emphasize the strength of the female as much as we ought to. So I think it's more about the messages. I think there's almost like a chasm where there's no messaging or not enough messaging. And then if there is any messaging, and I see this a lot with the teenagers, if there is messaging, it's only when they screw up.
Yeah.
So it's like they make a mistake, they post something that they shouldn't have posted on social media, for instance, and then they're dropping the hammer on this poor girl. And it's like, well, that's an okay thing to do in some circumstances, but you haven't built any kind of relational equity with her. You haven't spoken into her life, any values or any honor. So for you to come down so harshly on something like that, it kind of puts you out of place. And I think it damages the relationship between the parent and the child.
Talk to me more about this relational equity, because I've never heard of it explained quite in that way, but if you can kind of, from your perspective,
Oh
discuss
yeah.
it.
That's one of my favorite concepts. I always compare it, this metaphor, this analogy to like a bank account, right? And I believe that people are constantly making deposits and they're making withdrawals. So when we speak life, right, the power of life and death is in the tongue. So when we speak life into other people, I believe that we're making deposits. So if we're talking about interpersonal relationships or our spouse or even our children, I believe that when we speak positively, we're speaking that value, we're making a deposit. But when we speak harshly to someone, right, we're taking a withdrawal. When we treat people harshly, when we don't treat people fairly, we're taking a withdrawal from that bank account. And so what can happen is that bank account over time will become overdrafted. And we all know what happens when it's overdrafted. There's no money in there. And that's a situation where I think they haven't taken the time to build that relational equity.
So, you talked a lot about there are structures, there's systems. We've talked offline about this too, as well as, role models that they have. I mean, you being a father, she's going to look to you. She's going to say, how does my dad, how does a male treat a female, and build upon that? So that whole like daddy issues thing, while it's a half joking to a lot of people, really, if you're fortunate to have a father or someone who loves you, they're still getting messages from them as to how people will treat them, how if they feel valued. So, what can fathers do, or men, what men can do to further validate and express value, and not in like a creepy way, because that
Yeah.
happens too, right? So,
Yeah, I believe it all starts in the home and it starts with the wife. And so how do I treat their mother? How do I treat the mom? How do I treat the matriarch of the home? I think that says a lot about how to treat women in general, because that's not only a model for my daughter, because I want her to see what she can grow to expect. It's also a model for my son. I'm modeling the behavior of treating women with respect and dignity. I want them to perceive that as well, because when that is modeled poorly, I think is when we see a lot of those things like domestic violence, domestic abuse, and that kind of thing play out, because most of the time they just haven't seen that modeled appropriately. But speaking value, one thing that's so it's we have to be so careful. My wife and I have to be so careful about never making mention about physical appearance. And that's so difficult because I think in our culture it's so common to talk about that. For example, if we talk about weight and body image are huge issues that, I'd say I could clearly say 100% of every female client, all the female clients I've ever worked with have had some form of body issues as far as body image issues, not necessarily issues with their body, but body image issues. And I think that starts at such a young age that I think my wife and I, our heart is just kind of protect our daughter from that as long as we possibly can. But those messages always infiltrate. For example, my daughter, she's a great dancer. She does ballet and she just made the company team. So she's super excited and
Yay.
she has a natural gifting towards it. She's a great dancer. And the funny thing is, she's probably not built like your average dancer. Most times dancers are very petite
Yeah.
and very small. She's very stocky, athletic, but she's very stocky in how she's built, right? And so even early on, she received some comments early on about her not having the right body for ballet.
Wow.
And that just like rips my heart out, because I'm like, first of all, she's 8. Second of all, let's try not to
Why
comment
are
on
we body shaming at 8 years old now? It's just like,
why are we body shaming anybody, especially somebody that's 8?
period. That's better said. Yeah, it's ridiculous.
Right.
And I guess the other thing too is how has this really impacted mental health as you've seen it in your practice? And you have a quite a few statistics to share, but how
Yes.
has that impacted young girls and the way that they see themselves?
Well, I can tell you that the CDC reports that 60% of teenage girls report feelings of persistent sadness or hopelessness. The suicide rate, from what I've read, from ages 11 to 17 has increased by 46% nationally. That's a huge jump. I mean, as you probably well know, back in my day when I was studying, the highest suicide rate was the white male age 65 and up was the most predominant and highest suicide rate group. And now that has shifted to teenagers. And so I think we're seeing such a rise in that area because of, well, the social isolation, the online schooling, the increased reliance on social media because of the pandemic. I think that trend started before, but I think it was definitely exacerbated by the pandemic. I think it brought on a whole new level of that social comparison. And the thing is, when people have nothing to do, when people are locked in their homes, they get this false sense of bravado. I like to call them keyboard warriors.
Yep.
So
Had
they
quite a few
feel,
of those. Hmm.
I bet you know what I'm talking about, huh?
Yeah.
So there's sort of a false sense of bravado and the anonymity that they feel like they can attack people, and be very disrespectful. And I think that that's why we see the cyberbullying on the increase as well. And sadly, I do believe that the suicide rate is probably correlated to that.
And the other thing is, let's go back to like talking about changes in the body because the kids are super sensitive right now. They're going through hormonal changes,
Right.
in middle school and everything, and maybe becoming more sensitive, not wanting to even discuss it. So I also think we're doing a disservice by not having some of these conversations in adolescence with your
Mhm.
kids, just because it's it's a fact that your body is changing, and the question is, how do we help them navigate these changes in a way that they move towards acceptance that changes are here and
Yes.
that it's not a bad thing.
Right. Well, the average age of exposure to pornography is about 6 to 8 years old now.
Ooh.
And yeah, I mean, it makes me cringe, when I think about that. And one of the things that I think is so important with regard to what you just said is we have to educate our children about reproduction. We have to educate them about sexuality. We have to teach them about that before society has the opportunity to teach them about that. Because if we are looking for the people within society to teach our children about that, and they are going to be the first voice that they hear on that issue, I think that's a problem. And most of the time, their education is via pornography. And that's an even greater problem, right? And this just happened yesterday. I don't know if you heard about this law that just passed yesterday in Texas, but Pornhub now is requiring photo ID proof in the state of Texas to access their site. And because of that, Pornhub has taken off their site in the state of Texas.
There you go.
And
And I think that's goes back to and is parallel to the social media piece, right? Because there's a lot of social comparison as to what sex and relationships look like in these pornos and on Pornhub or wherever they watch it. But I
right.
think that social comparison happens, and then there's this really convoluted expectation as to how people connect with each other.
Absolutely. And there's I believe it's a societal goal. I mean, I don't want to delve too far into like a conspiracy theory zone, but I do believe that there is a goal of higher ups to have us more atomized as a culture. I believe that they're trying to move us further and further apart. And if you notice this is actually how the algorithms are set up in things like Facebook or Instagram. You know, it usually pushes people closer to their own polarity. So if you're on the right, for example, it'll push you more to the right. If you're on the left, it'll push you more to the left, and people will remain stuck in their own little myopic echo chambers, and that's a problem because if you're stuck in there, you're never going to hear any outside information. You're not going to
Right.
get any outside exposure to information that might not be your own, and it might be information that you just plainly don't agree with. But I think the exposure to other avenues of information is so important.
What are some of the strategies that you use to work with your adolescent females in sessions to have these discussions about changes in the body, changes in socialization? I think, middle school orientation, they were like, the principal was saying, you know what? They may not have the same friends as they did in elementary school. More than likely, they're not. Then they become friends with other people. Then there's this, that I just noticed, like, I always ask, was there drama today at school? Because it's really hard for both of them to say no. And
What a very open-ended and good question. That's a question a therapist would ask, right? Was there drama
right.
to, because you kind of know that there was. I find that if I'm being totally honest, based on my experience with that, I find that the female relationships, there's a lot more cattiness going on. There's a lot more backstabbing. There's a lot more emotional turmoil. And if you look at developmentally, the female develops 2 years in advance of the male. So the male is always going to be 2 years back as far as maturity, social maturity, emotional IQ, and things like that. They're always going to be kind of tailing behind a little bit. But I think that boys and girls, teenage men and women fight differently, right? I think men would probably just get physically violent with one another, whereas women will, they will backstab, they will bully, they will creep, they will do all kinds of different things to manipulate and hurt one another.
So, how do we foster this women empowering women mantra, or at least practice? Because I think it's really sad to me. Not only are women getting messages from, the outside world, but even within their communities or their schools, this is
Yeah.
happening. And so, what are some protective factors or strategies that you encourage your clients to use?
Yeah, absolutely. So getting back to that idea about identity, purpose, and design. So I always start with those three questions, whether I'm working with a 5-year-old, whether I'm working with a 55-year-old, it doesn't really matter. Those three questions are: who are you? What are you here to do? Right? And what is your design? What were you designed for? And I find that the vast majority of people that I speak with on a regular basis can't answer those three questions. And to me, okay, those questions seem very simple on the face, but they're pretty deeply
They're
rooted
deep.
questions, right? Because it's asking about the person's sense of selfhood, right? And so what I find is that when a person doesn't know that, when that thing is just kind of blowing in the wind, it attaches to certain things, right? And that's exactly what happened to me as a teenager, like I said, with all these, my different identities throughout high school, that I was very much like a wayward identity because I was like, oh, well, I can glom onto this, or oh, this looks cool. Let's try this for a little while. And it's like, I think adolescents are constantly trying to do that because they don't know what the answers to those questions are. But if we can establish a core truth of each individual and we can understand the answer to those three questions and we're able to produce those answers effectively, I think we're less susceptible to be kind of pulled away from our core identity of who we are.
Yeah. And I think part of it is really encouraging our girls to stay true to who they are despite all the noise that's going on, the drama. But that is really hard. I mean, I think back to middle school and high school where again it's just an awkward phase. And it's like that identity piece is kind of progressing, and it's not clear. It's not even clear as adults all the time, obviously, but even more so for the developing brain and the hormones on top of that, it just becomes so difficult for them. So, how do we encourage them to stay true to themselves?
Well, I think again, getting back to those points, if they know what their truth is, if they know who their self is, I feel like they would have a better chance of remaining true to it. If they don't have any idea of what that is, or if that thing is constantly in motion, it's kind of harder to track that down and nail that down. So when society comes and challenges this idea, for example, I think the first major time that this happens is when you go off to college for the first time, when you go off to a university for the first time. I know that for myself, I went to an extremely conservative Christian private high school, and I was extremely liberal at the time. And so I was like, I got to get out of here. These people are crazy. And so then I wanted to go do the most liberal college I possibly could. And I went to St. Edward's in Austin, and it was liberal. It was as liberal as the day is long. And what I realized there is that I'm not like these people. I realized that this was like so beyond the pale of where I was from from just purely a political, and philosophical belief perspective. And so when I went to grad school, I went to Dallas Baptist University. So I went in the complete opposite direction. Again, I went to a more conservative, but I was trying to achieve a state of balance with that. But anyway, to get to the point, that first approach into college is when a lot of your ideas and things that you've believed about the world begin to be challenged. I mean, I think any good school, I think that's the idea. I think that should be the idea, is that your traditions that you've held, the place that you've come from, the things that you've ascribed to throughout life are challenged. Now, the thing that's the true test is, how have they been raised? Because if they've been raised right, they will stand that test, and they will come out on the other side still holding and maintaining those beliefs. Now, they're going to learn along the way. They're going to learn about, all these different things from, regards to history and societal implications, but they can still maintain a core sense of who they are if they don't fall into the trends that are being presented to them, and the challenges are being presented to them.
So, as a father, what are some of the things that you do tell your daughter in terms of making her feel valued?
I hug her all the time, and I tell her that I love her all the time. I speak life. I speak life every opportunity I get. She's an artist. She loves to create things. I love her artwork. I speak life into that. It's like anything that I see that she's doing that's productive, I speak life into. The other day we were throwing the football. I was throwing it with the boys, and she came out, and I was teaching her how to throw a football and how to catch the football. And she's never been into that. She's never even tried it. And then after a few minutes, she's talking about, oh, well, I want to be a wide receiver. And that's great.
That is part of it, right? Is really continuing to say, I love you. And I think talking about emotions can be really, really difficult when things are so conflicted.
Right.
So saying, I love you, and hugging and all that makes them feel so valued. And so, how the other thing is, how do we open up conversations with them when they come home from school? Because are there other open ended questions that you would use or kind of coach your clients to use?
I love to have shoulder to shoulder time with my kids. Anytime I can take one of my children, getting them alone, because I have four of them. So it's like sometimes it's a challenge to get your child alone and have some shoulder to shoulder time. But I really try to take advantage of those opportunities to talk to them, and generally just to find out how things are going. And that's when I would ask a lot of those open-ended questions. It's funny, this year is the first year that we've started homeschooling. So my wife is actually homeschooling all three of our children.
She is the
Uh,
MVP. Let me tell
she's
you
the
that.
MVP. She's the real one. She's doing the work. I help out here and there, but she's taken on the brunt of that responsibility. And so now we don't really so much have that, how was your day? We really get to see how their day was, because we were, impacting their day and kind of helping them along throughout their day. And what I find so fascinating thus far about this homeschool journey is that we have all day with them now. Whereas before, we were giving our children up 8 hours a day, and then, we would see them. And unfortunately, around that time, my wife and I like to call that the bewitching hour, because you have that time period between like school and bedtime. And it is just like,
Chaos.
man, chaos, total chaos. Everybody's in bad moods. Everybody's hungry. Everybody's fussy. And you're just kind of doing your best to get them all down and situated so you can go about your night as as parents.
Yes. I think that that's important. So I also wanted to say, how do you and your wife engage in self-care or maintaining a intimate relationship together?
That's a really good question. So We both Sabbath. Today is my Sabbath actually. So Fridays is usually when I Sabbath. So I take the whole day off. I don't typically do anything related to work activities on Fridays. I'll go do something really fun that's just like for me. And that might take, 4 or 5 hours. And then like tonight, for example, I'm going to let her go because she texted me actually a few minutes ago and was like, I need a break. And I called her. I was like, do you need to go tonight? She's like, yeah, I need to go tonight. I'm like, all right. So, I'll get home tonight. I'll take care of bedtime, bath time, and I'll let her go and have her time, and so it's unique because we've had to realize that Sabbathing I don't want to say it has to, but for us at least, it has to look a little bit different than a traditional Sabbath, meaning that, her and I can't really Sabbath a whole 24 hours all at one time because we're in the home all the time with the kids. There is no break, there is no reprieve. So we have to figure out, and we've had to been extremely strategic with giving each other those breaks and giving each other that reprieve, and saying, hey, I got them. You go, like, take your keys, climb out the back window, like they won't see you. Because I get 57 questions, before she even gets to the car. So that's how we handle that, and you asked about the other, so intimacy, romantic relations has been a definite challenge with the homeschooling thing because they are there all the time, and so whereas before when they were at school 8 hours a day, let's just say there was a lot more opportunities.
Yeah, and I'm not just talking physically. I also think emotionally, right? Because like when you can't really engage in a full adult conversation, particularly with varying ages of your children, like there's someone around, right? And so I think part of that too is like how do you make time to have those adult conversations, That's hard.
Yeah. It is hard, and what we love to do is we like to set up like these weekend getaways that we'll go. Like we've got one in June that we're going to go to Fredericksburg, which is a beautiful kind of winery type place, but they've got a whole city and awesome, like great museums, just tons of fun stuff to do. But we'll get like an Airbnb, something like that, and just for the two of us, so that we'll have. Thankfully, we've got her parents here, so we got the grandparents that can kind of pitch in and help us when we have those opportunities. But that's usually what we try to do is carve out those times and make sure that we're scheduling that regularly and that we're not just going through because it can become so monotonous just parenting and working and parenting and working and parenting and working. So sometimes you have to break up that monotony with something new.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Well, you're doing a lot of great work in the community and practice, and you're an entrepreneur. So I'm wondering if you can tell folks ways to connect with you and also the organizations that you're working with.
Yeah, absolutely. So my company is called Remnant Recovery, and we are a family recovery coaching company. And so our mission is to bring an RTC or residential treatment level of care straight to the home, to the individual within the home. But we treat the entire family system. So our tier one plan, it allows for us to treat not only the individual that's suffering from a substance use disorder, but also the spouse. And then we also do marriage counseling. And then thirdly, we do counseling with the immediate family system as well. And so it's 6 hours of clinical work per week for a duration of 6 months.
Wow.
That's our tier one. And then our tier two is just the same duration. So it's 6 months, but it's 3 hours per week. And one of those is individual therapy. And then two of those are case management. And that could involve, working with psychiatric nurse practitioner or checking calls that are happening daily to make sure that, someone's getting up in the morning. For example, like a college student or something like that. That tier two option is very good for those because it creates a system of accountability. But we still also offer individual counseling. We're ages 13 and up now as the clientele that we accept now. We do marriage and family counseling, individual work, premarital counseling as well. We can also do MMPI assessments and interpretations. We do interventions in state and out of state as well as that.
That's amazing. It sounds very, very comprehensive. So, Satchel, thank you so much for being on the show. And, we have been afar great friends. And so I want to continue.
Oh, I would love that. That's awesome.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much.
I am so excited to announce that my book, Cancel the Filter, Realities of a Psychologist, Podcaster, and Working Mother of Color, is now available on Amazon through Kindle or a paperback copy. So get yours today. The link is in the description